Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in it. A hated government tax on it helped trigger the French Revolution. And in 1930, one man walked 240 miles to the sea, picked up a handful of it off the ground, and broke the law a euro, starting a movement that would eventually end British rule over 300 million people. That substance is sitting in a shaker on your kitchen table right now, and you probably haven't thought about it once this year. This is the history of salt, and it has shaped human civilization, economics, and revolution more than almost anything else on your dinner table. Long before coins existed, salt was one of the most valuable substances a human being could possess a euro, not primarily for taste, but for outright survival. Before refrigeration existed anywhere in the world, salt was essentially the only reliable method to preserve meat and fish for long periods of time, making it absolutely essential to feeding standing armies on long campaigns, sustaining sailors on multi-month trade voyages, and helping entire communities survive harsh winters when fresh food simply wasn't available. Ancient civilizations across the world independently discovered and fiercely controlled salt production wherever they could find it. From Chinese salt wells in Sichuan dating back over 6,000 years, some drilled to remarkable depths using bamboo drilling technology, to salt mines actively worked in Central Europe since the Bronze Age, producing wealth for the communities that controlled them for thousands of years. The word salary itself comes directly from the Latin word for salt, sal. While historians debate the exact mechanics, Roman soldiers' wages were closely tied to salt allowances or the money used to purchase it, and salt was valuable enough across the ancient world to function as a form of currency in some regions, traded pound for pound against gold in parts of North Africa well into the medieval period. Rome built an entire major road, the Via Salaria a Euro, literally the Salt Road a Euro, specifically to transport salt from coastal saltworks near the Adriatic into the heart of the growing empire. One of the earliest examples in recorded history of critical state infrastructure built almost entirely around securing a single essential resource. For most of human history, salt wasn't just valuable. It was worth killing and dying over. Across medieval Europe, controlling salt production and trade routes became a direct path to enormous wealth and political power. The city of Venice built much of its early medieval fortune on controlling Mediterranean salt trade, at times deliberately manipulating supply to drive up prices across the region. German cities along ancient salt routes, including one literally named Salzburg a Euro, Salt Fortress a Euro, grew wealthy and powerful almost entirely from taxing and controlling nearby salt mines. In West Africa, salt was so scarce and valuable south of the Sahara that it was, for centuries, quite literally traded pound for pound against gold along trans-Saharan caravan routes, with entire cities like Timbuktu growing wealthy as trading hubs between Saharan salt mines and gold-rich kingdoms further south. Governments across history quickly realized something else about salt. Because every single person needs it to survive, it makes an almost perfect thing to tax. If stories like this are your thing, hit subscribe a Euro. We drop a new hidden history of food every week. Nowhere did a salt tax cause more historical damage than in France. Starting in the 1300s, French kings imposed a salt tax known as the gabelle. It wasn't just an ordinary tax a euro, it was a deeply resented, wildly unequal system that varied enormously depending on where in France a person happened to live. Different regions paid dramatically different rates. Some provinces were exempt entirely due to historical political favoritism and negotiated privileges, and ordinary citizens in the most heavily taxed regions were often legally required to purchase a fixed minimum amount of government salt every year, whether their household actually needed it or not, under penalty of fines or imprisonment. The gabelle became one of the most hated taxes in French history, enforced by a dedicated corps of royal tax collectors, empowered to search private homes without warning and punish smugglers severely. Those caught illegally trading untaxed salt became known as faussonneurs, some of whom faced imprisonment, forced labor on galley ships, or even execution for what amounted to selling an ordinary household seasoning outside government channels. Salt smuggling networks became so widespread and deeply organized across rural France that they functioned almost like parallel criminal enterprises, embedded in the fabric of French rural life for generations, with entire villages sometimes participating in coordinated smuggling operations to avoid the tax collectors. By the late 1700s, resentment over the gabelle had become a powerful, widely understood symbol of everything unfair and unequal about the French monarchy's broader tax system, which consistently burdened commoners while exempting the nobility and clergy from many of the same obligations. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, the abolition of the gabelle was one of the earliest and most popular reforms demanded by revolutionaries in the streets of Paris, and the hated salt tax was formally abolished by the revolutionary government within just a few years of the revolution beginning. More than a century later, salt would once again become the spark for a revolution à euro, this time against the British Empire in India. Under British colonial rule, Indians were legally forbidden from independently producing or selling salt, forced instead to buy heavily taxed salt controlled entirely through a British colonial monopoly, even though salt occurs naturally along thousands of miles of India's own coastline and could, in theory, be freely harvested by anyone with access to seawater, a shallow pan, and sunlight. The salt tax hit India's poorest citizens hardest, since salt was a necessity that even the most impoverished families still had to purchase regardless of price. In March 1930, Mahatma Gandhi, already a prominent and internationally recognized leader in India's independence movement, announced he would walk from his ashram in Sabarmati to the small coastal village of Dandi, roughly 240 miles away, to defy British law directly by making salt from seawater with his own hands. The salt march took 24 days to complete, and by the time Gandhi reached the coast, thousands of followers had joined the growing procession along the route, with international newspapers closely covering the march and drawing global attention to India's independence struggle in a way previous protests had failed to achieve. On April 6, 1930, Gandhi bent down on the beach at Dandi and picked up a small lump of natural sea salt, openly and deliberately breaking British law in front of massive crowds and assembled international press photographers. The physical act itself was small, almost trivial. The symbolic power was enormous. Gandhi's deliberately illegal act of civil disobedience triggered widespread resistance across India, with millions of ordinary Indians beginning to illegally produce and sell their own salt in open protest of colonial law. Tens of thousands of protesters were arrested by British colonial authorities in the following months, including Gandhi himself, who was imprisoned without trial. The Salt March became one of the defining, most iconic moments of India's independence movement, helping galvanize the mass, nonviolent resistance strategy that would eventually force Britain to grant India full independence in 1947. Today, global salt production has reached well over 250 million tons per year. Though the overwhelming majority of it isn't used for cooking at all euro, it goes toward industrial chemical production, water softening, and de-icing roads in winter, food seasoning representing only a small fraction of total worldwide salt use. The mineral that once justified taxes powerful enough to trigger revolutions, and roads built specifically to transport it, is now so cheap and abundant that most people never think about it beyond a shaker on the dinner table. And in a strange historical twist, public health researchers today spend enormous effort warning people to eat less of a substance that entire civilizations once organized armies, tax systems, and revolutions around obtaining enough of. Next time you reach for the salt shaker, you're holding a substance that built cities, funded empires, sparked a revolution in France, and helped end British colonial rule over an entire subcontinent euro, sitting quietly on your table, completely taken for granted. If this one got you, check out our video on the history of potatoes next euro, another everyday staple with a surprisingly dark, world-changing history. Subscribe if you want a new deep dive into the hidden history of food dropped every week.